Is the Vice President with the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. He was elected just in October. I thought it had been longer than that, but I've known Rod longer than that. He tells me he's already put 22,000 kilometers on his car since then, so that it probably feels like longer than that to you. He also chairs AUP's Environment Committee, and so he's got a big interest in what's going to be said here today, and spent 30 years teaching biological sciences. The full 30 years at NATE?
36.
36 years at NATE, wow. Okay, so Rod, please introduce the next session.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm one of 6 vice presidents with AUPE, and I do chair the Environmental Committee there. But being one of 13 standing committees in a union of 95,000 members, it's easy to get lost in the crowd. But one thing we are about as a union is we're all about democracy. So that's why this topic really is near and dear to my heart. My hope is that this topic today can help us connect the dots, that we can plan a strategy to move forward, and that we can be bold. So I'm not going to go into deeply to all of the bios of the members in the panel. I mean, you could read most of it in your pamphlets, but I did sit down and talk to them ahead of time. A couple of them I've only just met. But Kevin Taft, I've followed his career since the Follow the Money campaign. And since I'm a bit of a science geek, I appreciate his reliance on data and analysis when he presents his arguments. He also said he's here today as a non-partisan participant. Well, I always thought he was too good for politics. Laurie Adkin, a respected professor and scholar at the U of A in political sciences. She wanted me to bring attention to a couple of her publications. Her book, The First World Petropolitics, and an article that's available online right now, I guess, is Crossroads in Alberta, Climate Capitalism or Ecological Democracy. She's been working on climate change policy for a while, and she has an interest in how our universities are funded. Isn't that a hot topic right now? She's also spent 8 years in Ontario working on relationships in labor and environmentalism. So that's very telling. Your moderator is Nikki Way. She's with the Pembina Institute, and her focus is on fossil fuel development. She's quite proud of the Landowner's Guide to Oil and Gas Development, and she wants to shift the provincial discussion on how we can shift to a decarbonized economy and how that will benefit people and the environment in the future. So, welcome to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Perfect. There always is a technical difficulty.
Closer to the microphone.
Yes, I think so. Thank you very much, Joel. I'm really excited that I was invited to moderate this panel. I've known Laurie for several years, 6 or 7 years. I was actually a former student of hers, and I've learned much over the years about the connection between the environment and democracy. And actually I met Kevin randomly in a farmer's market when I was going on at length about the oil sands tailings ponds, and he leaned in and said, "Hi, I'm Kevin Taft." So I was very excited to be invited here. Our topic today, I think, relates to much broader issues than just climate change, and I think a lot of you recognize that link. But climate change is something you probably hear a lot about throughout your daily lives. It's becoming more and more common as a public conversation, but it's not something that everyone fully understands, and especially the link back to our democracy. So I think we're going to get into some really interesting points here. One thing I do want to say is that what we're really talking about in Alberta's context is the supply of oil and gas and the role of that industry with regard to climate change. And typically we're usually talking about climate change from an individual's impact, their own consumption, how they drive their car, the things they consume. So we're going to take this to a different kind of space than perhaps what is typically discussed. So I'm just going to let Kevin start here with a few opening remarks, and then we'll go to Laurie.
So we'll see who has the broken microphone here. Apparently mine's working. Thanks, Nikki and Laurie. That morning at the farmer's market, I was by myself, and I was just trying to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee. It was Saturday morning, and these two women beside me were so passionately discussing climate change, I had to wade in. So, and it turned out it was Nikki, so there we go. When I was introduced, I made sure that Rod said I'm no longer involved in party politics, and that's true. But my years in the legislature can't help but informing me. And when I was in politics, in the legislature, everywhere I turned, I would encounter the oil industry. They were there, for party fundraisers, regardless of the party. They would be lobbying. I would encounter them through regulators, through the civil service. I remember walking into the office of a very top CEO in Calgary, and I was going in as the Liberal Party leader to raise money. And when the door to his office opened, who should come walking out but a university president who was probably there for the same reason I was there. So everywhere I turned in politics, there was the oil industry. And despite that, there was still tension. There was still a tension between the political process and the industry. Many of you will remember the royalty review panel, for example, and I give Ed Stelmach credit for that, and the industry was absolutely outraged over that. There was real tension there. The same with the Fred Dunn's review, the Auditor General, some of you might remember that, or you'll remember the dead ducks on Syncrude's tailings pond. There was a lot of tension between the industry and the political process. At the time, I thought to myself, that tension was healthy. I thought, well, this oil industry is so powerful, it cannot get any more powerful than it was, say, in 2008. But I think I was wrong. I think actually today it is no exaggeration to say that wherever its interests are concerned, the oil industry effectively runs Alberta. And that within Alberta, and that's an important constraint, but within Alberta, it is virtually operating without serious challenge. The issues that used to be driven onto the floor of the legislature, onto the front pages of the newspapers, just are not getting raised anymore. And I think, of course, that this is a very serious threat to democracy. Democracy is a contest. It's different groups, different organizations, different interests vying with each other. And a kind of unhealthy silence has descended within Alberta when it comes to challenging the oil industry. I very briefly just repeat the point that I make in my book, Oil's Deep State. A healthy democracy depends on a whole number of independent institutions vying with each other. And none of them should be should be interests of or instruments of a private interest. And so, for example, you have opposition parties and governing parties vying with each other, each independent. You have a civil service that is professional and nonpartisan and is independent from private interest. You have regulators that are independent at arm's length from the industries that they regulate. You have a whole series of institutions like that, courts, the media, school systems, and so on. My concern is that in Alberta, at this point in 2018, and this really has become evident in the last 3 years since the last election, that a whole range of these democratic institutions have been captured by the oil industry, have become effectively instruments of the industry, including both the opposition and the governing parties. I'm wading into contentious territory there. The Alberta Energy Regulator, which many of you will know is virtually completely funded by the industry, is chaired by an oil industry executive. Key parts of the civil service, especially Alberta Energy and Alberta Environment. Notable components of our university system with some really important exceptions. And even our public school system. I was talking to a teacher a couple of weeks ago at a teachers' convention. He came up to me after, and he'd been involved in preparing the science curriculum for school children in Alberta. And because the oil industry is a stakeholder, effectively the discussions on climate change and global warming and emissions were kind of washed right out of the curriculum. So under this model, it becomes accepted wisdom that the interests of the oil industry are the same as the interests of the people of Alberta. That's the political point I think we've come to in Alberta. And of course, that's not true. It's almost tragically untrue. But our challenge then, I think, is to try to reestablish ourselves as citizens of Alberta who are not just clients of what is a global oil industry. And you know, I think I might just stop there. I don't know how long, did I take 5 minutes?
I didn't even have to cut you off.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to open up, give you some food for thought. I'm used to getting heckled, and I hope you ate all the buns so you won't throw them at me, but if you do, that's okay. We'll stir up some good discussion.
Thank you very much. Right?
Great, thank you. You probably have to cut me off. All right, well, first I'm very grateful to have been invited to come today. Thank you, and thank you all for showing up and spending your Friday doing this important work. So I'm going to pick up on Kevin's comments and talk a little bit about the kind of state that could stand up to big oil and to do the work that's required to deal with climate change effectively, a state that would be prepared to lead and to intervene in the economy in the ways that are going to be required. In my field of work, a shorthand way of talking about this is talking about a green state. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what kind of actions the state needs to be taking. But I also want to make the point that a green state, in order to deal with the backlash and the organized structural power of large corporations, needs to be backed up by a green public, a strong, vibrant green public of some kind. And so this is often a kind of chicken and egg problem. You know, how do we get a green state without a green public? How do we get a green public without a green state? And you know, the only way out of this circle is that you have to work on all fronts all the time. You know, trying to work in civil society and at the same time trying to influence the nature of the government we get and what that government does. So that is a lot of work, but let's try to narrow this down a little bit. So I mean, my starting point is that where we're at now is that we need to move very rapidly to a post-carbon economy that's not dependent on oil revenue to provide Albertans with income security, the state with revenue, people with a good quality of life. And this means a greater role for government in planning and in directing public investment and in involving citizens. Because in my view, if we don't involve citizens in these planning and transition processes, we are not going to have a citizenry that feels that it has a stake, that it's had a voice, that it's had a role in planning the directions of Alberta society. The state is not going to have the foundations and the legitimacy it needs to carry through a project that's going to be difficult. There's a lot of educating to do, there's a lot of understanding to develop around what are the possible options. And there's a really important need right now for government to provide resources and leadership to move this whole agenda forward. So we talk about the importance of government, the possibilities for government to assist in strengthening, building civil society organizations, doing this kind of educational and mobilizational work. what could a government do? So this is something that we might have expected from an NDP government. Personally, one of my disappointments has focused here is that this is not so much a money item, that's, the failures are explained by budgetary questions, but there's a problem, there's an obstacle to the ways that the government is thinking about public involvement and what it's prepared to invest in doing, engaging the public and involving the public. So governments can do things like fund citizens' deliberations. These are really important processes because they give people an opportunity to really become informed about the complexities of a problem like climate change, to think through what are the alternatives that a place like Alberta could consider as an economy that's not reliant on the export of bitumen and synthetic crude. So these deliberations allow people to hear from different experts, really consider what's on the table rather than just what's been put on a menu by a government or a party for them to consider, but to really, without restriction, consider what kind of a future Alberta we could build, what we would want it to look like, on what values, what would we prioritize, and then think about what are our resources, what do we have to work with, how can we do this? And then out of that process, our deliberation can make recommendations to a government. And once you have a process like that in place, the government has a really strong basis of legitimacy to turn to because it can say, we did a serious consultation, we've involved the public has had access to information, we're listening to informed citizens, this is not a snapshot public opinion poll, these are the recommendations we got, and you can use that to stand up against the right-wing libertarian, keep getting the name wrong, United Conservatives of Alberta, what are they? Okay, and I have this awful tendency in my old age to forget things I don't like to think about. And, or the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and other sorts of, and the Friends of Science and so on, right? So, they can turn and say, look, we've done more than just a public opinion survey where we've got a snapshot of the way people think now, based on whatever sources of information they may have. Now we can say we've done a process where we have really good feedback that's supported by the average Albertan citizen who's had an opportunity to become informed. So that's one thing governments can do. They can fund and support this kind of an exercise, and there are a lot of organizations out there ready to assist and help with organizing that type of thing. Did I run out of time already? With civil society organizations and university researchers to implement community level programs and so on. And I think importantly that government can undertake regional planning processes that build in citizen deliberation in an iterative fashion so that we can start really trying to envision what our future economy and society could look like after oil. This is something we have not heard at all. What we've been hearing so far is a kind of reproduction of the old discourse of the PCs around why Alberta has to continue on the current path of dependence on energy, being an energy exporter and supplier, particularly fossil fuels. We are getting new elements mixed into this, and I have written about the suite of proposals and measures that the government has introduced on climate change, and I'm not entirely negative by any means. I'm very strongly in support of many of the things they're introducing, but what we're hearing in terms of political discourse is too much of a repetition of the old version of what is Albertan identity, what are our Albertan interests, as Kevin is saying. We're still getting the picture that the interests of the oil industry are identical to those of Albertans, and that's just not the case. So we need to hear that there is another vision possible and that there's a process to make this transition, and that process actively involves citizens, and that means transforming the nature of citizenship and making it more democratic. I will stop being voluntary. I have to turn off my mic.
Okay, perfect. Well, I have lots of questions, and I'm sure the room does as well, so I'm sure we weave some of the last thoughts in. But I kind of want to take this up a little bit more broadly. I think a lot of Albertans who aren't embedded in climate change discussions on the daily, they see some of the things that the government has done. They hear about this oil sands limit, they know about the carbon tax, they see the energy efficiency program, and there seems to be something happening. So how does that square with what we need to do, and why is there more of a pressure to continue pushing that line?
So yeah, I'm sure there's a huge amount of confusion, and I think, Nikki, you're right to caution people like me and perhaps Laurie that we live in a bubble where we just talk to each other on these issues and assume everybody's on side, and then you go out to an election or something and you realize, whoops, it didn't happen that way. One of my concerns with what we're seeing from the current government, I guess we're going to pick up off of Laurie here, is the same old narrative. We were talking this morning about First Nations narratives and white settler narratives and so on. The same old narrative about Alberta as oil as a central component of Alberta's identity and Alberta's welfare and so on. And there is a huge amount of misinformation, deceit, confusion that's deliberately sown among the public around these issues. So the benefits, for example, of the Trans Mountain Pipeline to BC that will actually flow back to the people of Alberta are much smaller than you would expect from what you're hearing from the government and from the media. In fact, I'll just throw out a little bit of information for you. In the last 2 years, probably coming up now to the last 3 years, the Alberta government has actually earned more from casinos and liquor stores than it has from its royalties on bitumen. We're selling about now 3 million barrels of bitumen a day to big oil companies. They may be headquartered in Calgary, but they're mostly owned by Americans and Chinese. So we're selling them 3 million barrels a day, and we actually earn more from liquor stores and casinos. That's how low royalties are. That's the kind of information that I think is powerful to share with people. It's easily tracked down. I could track it down and refer people to the specific pages in the Alberta Finances. That kind of counter-information, I think, is the kind of thing to drop into conversations, whether it's at your workplace, whether it's at the dinner table. Say, you know, I'm hearing all this about the benefits of Alberta's oil industry. But, gee, did you know? And then you can follow it through. Now, it's hard to get that information unless you're a kind of nerdy guy like me or others, but there is information around there, and if there are organizations like Public Interest Alberta or Parkland, which does a lot of tremendous work on this, you know, start sharing that information as much as you can. Inform yourself and talk. Just talk.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm curious, Laurie, can you give us a sense of how do we square up what Alberta's currently done and what we need to, like where's the gap? Like the public probably doesn't hear about the gap in terms of our current action and why it isn't good enough. And so when we're talking about the industry's interest not being the same as ours and the need to further act, what does that mean?
Oh, there's so many things to pick up on here. So, I mean, we just had a poll showing 30% of Canadians don't believe in the science of climate change, and the percentage is even higher in Alberta. This is a down slope. We have this is an increase in the percentages of Canadians who don't believe in the science of climate change. So it's telling us that those people who have an interest in undermining action on climate change are being much more successful in their communications and their use of media than the forces that are pushing towards change. And so that raises a lot of questions about how effective governments are being in talking to people. And I think that in Alberta, you know, again, while the government is not denying the existence of climate change, and it has brought in a number of programs, especially the increase in share of renewables and the phasing out of coal and action on methane and so on, which are important, that there's still, I think, misleading Albertans in regard to the future employment prospects that will come from building pipelines, another upgrader, or bringing more investment into the oil sands, because the number of jobs in those sectors that we can foresee are never going to be enough to deal with existing unemployment or, you know, future growth of the workforce. And not only that, we're perpetuating a really distorted economy where most of the high-paying jobs are jobs for men in construction and trades and energy sector work, and that means that, women are kind of shut out of that sector of the economy, and it's not a well-diversified economy that provides opportunities for educated people coming out of the universities and so on. So we want to do a better job building a more diversified economy, one that really can offer secure livelihoods to people in the future that are not just based on the period of construction of a project. And also the government needs to be, I think, talking to Albertans more about the real negative consequences of climate change for Alberta. And there are really big concerns around the future with water scarcity, increasing drought, violent extreme weather, floods, fires, and particularly affecting southern Alberta agriculture. These are things that people deserve to understand and to know that are coming down the road, and then at the same time investing in the infrastructure to deal and to mitigate greenhouse gases and to adapt to climate change, to, for example, build up our water infrastructure and so on. These are areas that will create a large number of jobs for a long period of time. So, I think looking at the risks and also the future, the benefits, the foundations we can build a new economy on are things that need to be communicated much better.
Do you have any last thoughts on that?
Well, we could go on forever. I feel like everybody's quietly digesting lunch right now. We're going to put you all to sleep here.
Thanks a lot.
What? I'm reflecting on myself here. So, I think one of the things we just really need to get into our heads is that the physics of climate change are unrelenting. And the pressure to get away from oil and coal and natural gas is only going to intensify. This is not an issue that's going away. My grandchildren, my grandchildren's grandchildren are going to be breathing the carbon dioxide that came out of the exhaust pipe of my car when I drove here today. That's how long this issue is going to go on. So the pressure for the world to stop using the very thing that our wealth relies on, Alberta, is just going to intensify, and that's oil. So what we have found when the oil industry has got such a deep grip on Alberta's government is that we are locking ourselves into a 20th century industry when most of the world, Europe, China, Japan, California, are working like crazy to get off of oil. And if we don't face up to that reality, if we don't start having that conversation, if we don't hold the government to account to begin realistically facing the future, we're just going to have an extremely painful transition. We're going to go through the kind of pain that Detroit has gone through in the last several years, and all kinds of other examples. So for those of you who are in the building trades or in public sector unions, you need to start realizing that over the next decade, Alberta's finances are going to become, in my view, under more and more and more stress. And that's going to be played out in your lives and in all of our lives, because the money for public sector employees is simply not going to be there. Not without the kind of changes that so far we haven't seen, such as a complete revamping of the tax system. So I guess it's kind of a wake-up call here. The Alberta that we've lived in and prospered with for a lifetime is not going to recover, in my view. And I think even Jillian and others this morning were saying, even in Calgary, people are realizing those jobs aren't coming back. There's not going to be another boom. So the challenge to us is to face this situation as adults.
So I want to pick up on that then. There's kind of a push that's happening that will push us away just as much as our own kind of pull efforts, right? Like the idea of acting on climate change being of our own accord, but there's pressures that are going to force us likely to change anyway. So knowing that, and knowing that this is likely going to leave people out in the cold if we're not careful, what is the role of the government, or perhaps outside of government, what is the role of civil society in planning, in visioning, creating a vision of our future that's different than what we currently know? Look, we're not looking in the rear view mirror anymore, so what can we build towards, and how can these two institutions help us?
Yeah, this is a problem that we're facing now with the government that, in a way, I think is letting us down in terms of leadership and support for building these alternatives. So, I mean, it suggests that as civil society actors, we don't give up on government and parliamentary politics, but at the same time, we need to start to become more independent and make things happen ourselves. And I'm hoping that people in the audience will have ideas to contribute to this. I have a couple of thoughts. One is that in terms of a planning exercise, and starting to put together the bones of what an alternative economy would look like, you know, what we would build it on, where do we draw our resources from, that organizations that have strengths already in the trade union movement, the research think tanks, NGOs, maybe the universities, First Nations, Métis settlement, could come together and start drafting their own kind of green transition plan for Alberta. Their own ideas about what do we need to invest, and where are we going to get the capital, where are we going to get the revenue, how can we think about sustainable agriculture, producing value-added goods and food for regional markets instead of long-distance trade. You know, what can we plan on in terms of employment that will come from energy efficiency work and retrofitting and so on, renewable energy sectors, human services that we really need a lot of investment in, and those are good jobs, right? So, you know, we have to start really being able to come up with some kind of set of concrete reforms and alternatives to put to people, and to, regardless of whatever government, whatever party's in government, that we can independently assert that pressure and speak to the public directly and say, look, there are alternatives. These are alternatives, and really work for those. So, you know, a lot of this makes us think about, well, what resources then do we have to do this planning? What kind of expertise do we have and not have? Where do we need to get it? And who can coordinate this? And then communication. So there's lots of dimensions of it. But as Kevin was saying, I think, you know, it's misleading and it's not helpful to let people think that we can go on for another 40 years on the same basis. I mean, we are struggling now to find markets for a product which is high cost. The world is flooded right now with shale oil. Our product is not competitive, and it's not because of a carbon tax. You know, it's not competitive because there is so much oil out there. And we have to do our bit to make sure that it doesn't get burned.
No, go ahead, Nikki. You want to move this along?
Yeah, I have another question just to change gears a little bit. We have just a few minutes left before we're going to ask questions, or let the audience ask some questions. So I'm really interested, Kevin, in your book, you do speak about this just a little bit, but what are some of the things that this government, or governments generally, can do to increase the autonomy between the industry and democratic institutions? And I'm sure Laurie has plenty of thoughts as well.
Sure. Well, you know, there's case after case after case of what can be perceived as conflicts of interest or overlapping responsibilities. So, for example, you can pick one institution at a time, but the Alberta Energy Regulator, I think it's a real problem that their chairman is an oil industry executive. You know, and that's an appointment from the provincial government. The provincial government could appoint somebody who was highly qualified and highly knowledgeable, but not from the industry, to run the regulator. I mean, how would you feel if the regulator, the CRTC, I think it is, who sets your cell phone rates, how are you going to feel if the chairperson of the CRTC worked for a cell phone company? I mean, you know, it's not going to be legitimate, but we live with that every day in Alberta. Firewalls around funding to universities is really, I think, important, or at least forcing these conflicts to be made public. There's a page after page in my book. I couldn't believe as I was writing this out of the University of Calgary, it's almost comical how many conflicts of interest there are between the industry and the Board of Governors and the funders and the professors. And they've lost some outstanding international faculty who just said, I'm not going to tolerate being pushed around by the industry anymore and being told what I can and cannot research, and they've left. What the heck is the oil industry doing having a right to comment on what is in our school curriculum, for example? These are things that can all be addressed with the stroke of a few pens by the provincial government if they had the political will. My point, my argument, and I could easily be wrong, but my argument is that they are, in fact, they've had this kind of, what was the old Star Trek, you're too young for that, the Vulcan mind meld with the oil industry. And so I'm not sure they even see these issues as problems. But they should, and what's heart-wrenching to me as somebody who spent years in the legislature with people like the current premier and so on, is there was a time when they would not have tolerated that, when they would have been loud and forceful on the floor of the legislature. And it's kind of heartbreaking to watch how it's played out. But many of you are members of the New Democratic Party. Challenge, push, demand, require firewalls and proper conflict of interest requirements and so on.
All right, we're going to turn to questions from the floor. If anyone's biting at the bit, yeah, right here.
My name is Ginger. I know that the government is working on some diversification in revenue strategies throughout the province that don't include the oil industry, because they know that they've had to some degree, reduce their interest in that area because it's not giving us the same pay that it has in the past. But all those strategies are going to take time to develop, whether that's using our parks or opening our parks to more global economies for people who are backpackers, or using global races or whatever it is, which increases our tourism as well, which does put economy back into our area, to others like we've talked about wind and solar and stuff. But all of those things are always contingent on, to some degree, how is that impacting our wildlife? How is that impacting our parks? So there's always those studies that take time to develop to make sure that everything cohesively works together. So are you seeing that? Do you feel that those are valid points to go forward, and that they are doing some type of diversification and trying to find other economies to replace the oil?
Yeah, I think at this point, too much of the investment in diversification is still happening in the fossil fuel sector. And I see that, for example, the Climate Change Emissions Management Fund, which takes the revenue from the carbon levy on large emitters. The research I'm doing shows that almost half of that money that is dispersing is going to fossil fuel related technologies. The Energy Efficiency Agency that was set up to provide funding for households and energy efficiency programs that roll out to consumers and so on, now has opened up a window for funding small firms in the fossil fuel sector to increase energy efficiencies as well. So it's wherever you look, really, in terms of tax credit programs, funding through Alberta Innovates, funding use of the carbon levy, a lot of it, and also money to the universities, is going into fossil fuel related research, or things like carbon reuse. There's a lot of investment done in that down in Calgary, about $20 million. And so these are, or the new investment in the upgrader, right? So these are things that the government is representing as diversification, but they're still linked to downstream, upstream sideways stream of fossil fuels. And there are other areas that are, we need a much faster build out of renewables and the infrastructure for that. And all the money that you put into fossil fuel sector is not going into other things, right? So.
And I just want to pick up on the second part of that question, which is, what do we diversify in other than the oil and gas industry? Where are the jobs and the economic booms? Do you see any opportunities on the horizon that we're missing that we can really kind of take a hold of, or is this a lot more work than it is clear to us?
Well, I have something to say about that, but
Okay,
you go ahead if you want. Yeah. Well, I did list a number of things that we could be looking at, but the fundamental problem is a revenue problem. I mean, if this is public investment led, then you're looking at questions of why don't we have public ownership of the new renewable sectors so that we're getting the revenue as well as investing in them instead of subsidizing the private sector. Why aren't we? We really need to deal with the revenue problem to figure out, then where do we invest? And this is also why we need a comprehensive and inclusive process that brings together the knowledges that different organizations and individuals have to figure this out, because not any one of us alone has all the answers to what this alternative would look like. For me, one thing that should be high up on the list is agriculture, is investment in smaller scale sustainable agriculture for local and regional markets, developing some value added out of agricultural products. And then, of course, on top of that, a big area of employment that needs investment is human services. We need childcare. We need elder care. We need, more healthcare providers. So
with that, one gap that we see is the same workers that may lose the opportunity through the industry that we're talking about. Where do they go? Kevin, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I think Laurie makes a point. None of us have all the answers. Maybe we don't have any answers. But one that's even the industry is showing some interest in. There are billions and billions of dollars of liabilities ultimately for the taxpayer on unreclaimed wells, and the Auditor General's report of 3 years ago identified $20 billion of costs at risk to the taxpayer for cleaning up those mines at the oil sands. This is unfunded. This is money the industry should be putting up and hasn't put up. There are ways of organizing systems so that people who used to drill these wells can now be employed to clean them up. And so you're creating employment, you're cleaning up the environment, you're perhaps developing some new technologies that can be used elsewhere. So there's a bit of imagination that way, and some of those issues are going to be forced on us. There are some very important legal cases right now determining who's going to be paying for the cleanup of some of these wells. So there's, I don't want, I'm old enough now that I've heard so many rounds of diversification discussions for Alberta. I don't know what I can say anymore, what I can think anymore, but I will be sure that I do not have the answers for that. It's going to be a collective process.
Okay. Thank you. Another question from the audience?
My name is Peter. Recently, the City of Edmonton hosted an IPCC conference, and one of the keynote speakers was Katharine Hayhoe, noted climate scientist and a noted climate change communicator. And she reiterates the same points you've made. Climate change is happening, humans are responsible. But the point she made, we closed that with, was that the window of time to do something about it is closing quickly. I think that if there's any issue that requires civil disobedience, nonviolent, like what you see in Burnaby, this is one issue that requires it, and I'm curious to see what you think about that.
Well, I'm on record as defending civil disobedience. I don't know if, well, I've been in Alberta for a long time, so I lived through the Klein years and so on, and there was constant threats against environmentalists and accusations, and they were characterized as terrorists, I think, under the Stelmach government. And so, I mean, I think civil disobedience is a civil right.
You know, that's up to individuals. I can easily imagine circumstances where I would end up becoming civilly disobedient or uncivilly disobedient. I agree. I think that the nonviolence is important, but I do think, you know, I find myself wondering, just going off of Peter's question here about what happened in Burnaby, and there's been arrests, and you might have seen Elizabeth May and another MP were arrested there. I find myself wondering, how much have Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau thought through the next 6 or 8 months? Are they prepared for an open stand-up? Are they prepared? Are Justin Trudeau and Rachel Notley prepared to have people killed in order for this pipeline to be built? Because it could easily come to that. Have they thought that through? So Peter will, you know, we'll see what happens, but it could be, as John Horgan was predicting in BC just the other day, it's going to be a long, hot summer in BC.
Anyone else from the floor?
Harold, question with regard to the negotiated treaties like NAFTA and so on. To what degree will those limit what we can do locally? Because you're suggesting that we can develop local industry around the agriculture and so on, but I suspect we've given that away too. And one of the problems I think we have in diversifying our economy is we've become locked into certain industries like the oil. You are the oil providers. Well, you provide us some wood too. You can chop that down for us, and maybe a few other little things. But you're really restricted. As soon as you start talking about even refining the oil, here it becomes a whole different question again. So I'd like some comment on that, please.
I can't see off the start how NAFTA would affect our ability to develop local agriculture. It does affect exports of synthetic crude to the United States, insofar as under the proportionality clause, if we reduce our supplies to the US, we have to reduce the supply domestically proportionately. So we are restrained in our ability to develop a domestic energy strategy by NAFTA. There are, you know, NAFTA is being renegotiated at this point, and there are people saying that we should get out of that clause. That's one of the things that should be dropped in the interest of Canada being able to have more autonomy over developing its own sustainable development strategy. So I don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. But there are probably some ways around that. I think that one could certainly do things that would be contested, but there are environmental grounds as well that could be tested in relation to NAFTA if we were to reduce our exports to the United States. Our main market for bitumen is the United States, because that's where the refineries are that are equipped to upgrade heavy oil. And there's, from what I understand, not that much demand elsewhere for that product. So that is the relationship that we need to focus on.
Well, one of the very interesting things, going back to the topic, the democracy, and talking about this, is in these negotiations, Alberta, although not at the table directly, does have an opportunity to voice its position and what it would like to see. And one of the main things that we saw from the Alberta government was panels dedicated solely to energy and solely energy at that table, discussing how do they want to, how do they want NAFTA to play out, essentially, or what are the risks and the opportunities with the NAFTA negotiations. So I mean, it's yet another example of this relationship between the industry and our democracy as well.
Well, the Alberta government was a strong supporter of the free trade agreement back in the 1980s. Got us into this trap.
I think, trying to connect some of the panels, the panel before lunch, both outstanding panels. The one on reconciliation got me thinking about, I guess as a privileged older white male, I'm on the hot seat here, but
Which part are you guessing about?
yeah, I'm immediately thinking, backpedal. It got me to thinking about colonization. And effectively, we have become a kind of neo-colony. There was a time when we aspired to develop and process our resources here. Syncrude, Suncor, they were required as a condition of their getting their licenses to actually upgrade the raw material here in Alberta. And the expectations for that were lowered and lowered until they essentially disappeared with other oil sands plants. So what we're doing is stripping the most unprocessed, conceivable kind of oil-based product and shipping it to other countries to be upgraded, which is essentially the same model that was used by the fur trade 150 years ago. And it was the same model used in the early days of settlement where we shipped raw, unprocessed grain all around the world. For a little while, we actually aspired to be more than just an economic colony. And we are sliding backwards now. And there's not just an economic side to that, there's a political side to that, because colonies are not, by definition, healthy democracies. They are not self-determining. It's not their citizens who force the course of history on their society, it's the colonizers who control that. And so the struggles that we have over land control, over First Nations, over who controls the water, over all kinds of environmental issues are not just about those environmental or social issues. They are also fundamentally, they all converge in a struggle for democracy. And that's really what we're about here. And that's what this organization, Public Interest Alberta and Parkland and the labor movement and so on, it's so important to understand that for whatever that specific issue you are engaged in, you are also engaged in strengthening democracy.
Bravo.
Okay, so I agree with everything that people are saying, but I have to admit that, like most Albertans, I'm not convinced that the getting rid of the oil industry and pretending that we're going to quickly diversify, that in fact there won't be huge unemployment created in the short term, which to me, suggests, like in a room like this, we're in fact, regardless of what the actual background is, this is a very privileged group sitting here, and who's, I would say I had a career as a university professor, but oil paid for it. That oil has paid for my good life, and I think about my children who are not, didn't get a good education, when one, in fact, has made good money as a pipe fitter, and so when I hear that, we have to have more educated people doing this, I think, he just turns to shit in all this, and so do all of his friends, and I know how they talk about stuff, and they don't talk like anybody in this room. So where in this democratic debate are all of these people?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and we touched on it briefly. We were starting to talk about just transition, essentially. How do we bring these people along? So if we want to elaborate on this any further, please do.
Well, we also tend to, in Alberta, talk about job creation always as if, we're talking about certain kinds of jobs without really thinking that, not necessarily everybody wants to go out of high school and work on an oil rig. There are people who do want to do other things with their lives too, and we need to create an economy that's diversified enough that, people can start to think about what they'd like to do with their lives and educate themselves accordingly and not feel that really that's what you do as a young man here, that's your option. And so, we have to be able to think about the possibility of an economy that isn't reliant on just one sector for employment and a third of provincial revenue. I agree with you that we are losing and have already lost a lot of jobs with the downturn, the fall in the price of oil and the withdrawal of investment, the not coming in of new investment to some extent, the lower price for oil. I don't think realistically we are going to be able to employ the 38 or 40,000 people who've lost jobs back in that sector again. And that's why we need to think about transition in a planned way and not just leave this up to market forces and chance and begging investors to come here and put more money into something else related to fossil fuels. We really have to start planning for how we're going to employ people, and not just jobs, but good jobs. I mean, jobs that are stable over long term and that are environmentally sustainable jobs. And in addition to employment, I think there's a lot of things that come into this, and we need to be thinking about reduction of work time and income security. So income security beyond employment in terms of social wage universal programs, which are also job creating. So dealing with the perfectly legitimate aspirations of young people to have interesting and meaningful work in their lives, and income security means thinking a lot around finance and revenue and social programs, universal programs, and not just what can we make.
So this morning, Ricardo spoke about being on the defensive for so long, and that sometimes the progressive side of the political agenda needs to go on the offensive. I think put forward visions for the future, which is kind of what Laurie's doing here, talking about income, alternative incomes, and social programs, and so on. And that's the kind of vision that groups like this can put together. I mean, you could pull together a summit for a future Alberta after oil, and take a page out of Ralph Klein's book. God forgive me for saying that, and pull together a whole lot of people and have a very public summit. What is the future of Alberta going to look like when the oil industry is going down the drain? Because Alvin, I think you're right. There's going to be a terrible number of casualties, economic casualties in this province. I don't know how much you follow this, but any number of major countries now, Germany, Britain, European countries, China's talking about this way, are actually seriously talking about banning internal combustion gasoline burning automobiles within the next decade. Banning them. Like zero. This isn't fantasy. I'm not making this up. There's serious discussion about this. That's not very far down the horizon. And the world doesn't have to go to zero oil before Alberta's economy is absolutely in smithereens. So we either engage in the change and try to lead it and try to challenge our government to confront it, or change will be done to us, and it'll be a lot more unpleasant the other way.
Exactly. So there's obviously a lot of international pressures like you were mentioning, but going back to the theme that industry's interests aren't necessarily the public interest, when we look at the recovery efforts right now, the numbers are a little bit rounded in my head. Just shy of 50,000 jobs were expected to have been lost, and by 2020 it's predicted that there's only about 17,000 that will be recovered. So, and that's because of automation, new technology, the efficiencies these companies put in place during the downturn. And so this narrative that we have around the industry equals jobs, equals economic opportunity for Albertans is what we're trying to decouple here.
Actually, that reminds, there's a question. I was just going to say that when, you might remember the royalty revenue review panel in 2006, that when Premier Stelmach said that he was going to implement the recommendations to increase the royalty rates and so on, there was a major campaign launched by the oil and gas companies where they put the small guys out in front, as they always do. But I remember the kind of onslaught of radio and television ads where they basically said, you know, we've given so much to Alberta, we've created your prosperity, we've given you so many jobs, we love you so much, you know, etc. But if you do this to us, we'll have to leave. You know, we'll go someplace else. I called it the spousal abuser discourse where, you know, I've given you a castle, my darling, but if you don't do what I want, I'm going to have to beat you up. You know, so it was kind of, you know, it was, and I thought at that point maybe people would get the point that this industry isn't here because they love us, right? It's here because it's profitable, and it stops being profitable. We'll do what capital does perfectly logically, perfectly rationally. It will move to where it gets a higher rate of return. And it will invest in labor-saving technologies, is what technologies are all about, saving labor, right? So again, this kind of constant telling us that energy is our friend, you know, it's reinforcing a kind of identification of Albertas with the industry, which is very difficult for the left to cope with, right? I mean, you're looking for some other kind of identity, and when it comes to climate change, I think one of the things we're seeing is a loss of sense of responsibility and a connection to people in other parts of the world. Like, this isn't just about us. We have a moral obligation, you know, to the fate of other people on this planet and other species on this planet. You know, we can't just blithely go on saying, well, Alberta doesn't have to do anything. In 2030, we can have 274 megatons of CO2, which will be 68% of Canada's total emissions if Canada meets its Paris Accord targets. That means other provinces are going to have to disproportionately reduce their emissions. How are they supposed to do that, right? And we can go on, but you can always kind of push the ball further into the future or onto somebody else. But that sense of we are also global citizens and we are also connected to other Canadians, what happened to that? This idea of Albertans just being some kind of tribe that only has to look out for itself and is always under siege has got to stop. They have got to stop saying this.
A quick observation and then a question. In response to Alvin's reflection on how much the oil industry gave to him, and I would suggest that we think about how do other provinces who don't have oil and gas, how do they provide the things? And the answer is they do so through fair taxation. And that's why if we want to make this transition, we have to get after fair taxation. More specifically, the question, and it's an uncomfortable question, I go back to the theme of the conference, a crossroads in front of you and two paths. And we did not mean by that the NDP and the UCP. You know, like, that's really not a choice, right? What we were really talking about is the better roads that we need to travel on. And here's the uncomfortable question. These are our friends in government right now, and they've done some wonderful things in a whole lot of areas. In campaign and party finance, in labor legislation, in minimum wage. But on the central question, on the fundamental question in front of us, on this choice, our friends are on the wrong road. Our government has taken the wrong road on this whole larger question of where we're going next with respect to climate change and the fossil fuel industry. And you heard Alex say last night, I don't want any more infrastructure being built to support a fossil fuel industry down the line. So my question is, how do we balance those two things? We really appreciate what people in this government have done, but they are fundamentally on the wrong road, and to the point where they're pushing so hard and issuing pom-poms to people to cheer for pipelines and denigrating environmentalists in the process, right? What happened with that Leaf manifesto was unconscionable. That was an aspirational document, and it didn't deserve to be trashed and denigrated and personally leveled by people at the front. So that's my question. How do we reconcile this fact with this is obviously the best choice, and these are terrific people, but our friends have gone down the wrong road. What do we all need to do together to get them on a better road?
Such an easy question.
Well, they did throw out the idea of, civil society actors coming together and trying to develop their own agenda of reforms, their own kind of blueprint for the province, if you like, and trying to make that process really inclusive. And it would have to happen over some time. It wouldn't happen right away. And I was hoping that you might have some ideas about who the participants in such an exercise could be and how it could get started. Or perhaps you have other ideas.
Oh, Larry, that's the core question. I guess I looked at the audience here, and I suspect several of you are connected to the New Democratic Party. I just have that hunch. I think sitting down, going to the offices, going to the campaign managers, going to the MLAs, and just maybe there's an organization here who could pull together a simple fact sheet. I was on the Government of Alberta's Energy Department website the other day on royalties, and it's actually quite a good website, pages and pages, but it's written in language most of us can understand. And towards the end, there's a title called, I think, something like the functional or effective rate of royalty, and you read through that. And this is, in the back of my mind, is the fact that Peter Lougheed, and I'm always careful, I don't want to sanctify Peter Lougheed, but he did follow his phrase. He thought like an owner, and he duked it out with the oil industry. And on Suncor and Syncrude, he got, for the people of Alberta, a 50% royalty rate. Now, that's a net royalty rate, but still, 50% on the first barrel of production. Today, if you went there right now on the Government of Alberta's royalty website, the effective royalty rate on pre-payout is 1%, and then on post-payout it's 5.2%. So these are just simple facts. I know when I was in the legislature and it was a 1% royalty, and we would stand up in the legislature and challenge the government, how dare you have a 1% royalty? That put pressure on Ed Stelmach to bring forward the royalty review. That kind of, a set of facts like that, putting it in quiet, personal meetings with the power brokers of this government could have an effect. Larry's absolutely right. Until the revenue stream of this province is adjusted and corrected through fair taxes, its future is in serious, serious trouble.
So I'm actually going to challenge you on that.
Okay.
A moderator with an opinion, that's a dangerous thing. I think that there's a responsibility of people in this room and the networks that you have to be more public and more loud. I don't think it's about more facts. I don't think it's about talking to our friends. When I do go to an office, I usually actually find someone who agrees with me when I'm talking to someone in this government. But what they tell me is they need the public support, and they find that they have not seen that, and they've lost the public conscience on that, because the narrative has been written for us that industry interests are public interests. So I think it's the role of people in this room and our networks and your family members and everyone to be much more engaged on a public side of things and be very thoughtful about this. How do we redefine the narrative in the public? I don't think another fact sheet's going to move us. So with that, I think it's our time is done.
We're out of time.
Thanks so much to all three of you. It's been such an enlightening and engaging and, to me, riveting discussion.